For this chapter, we're going to talk about motor learning. So you're probably thinking, well, haven't we been talking about motor learning the whole time? Well, we have to some extent. We've also been talking about motor behavior. So motor behavior more, explaining why the behaviors we do go in a certain way and why certain things happen. For example, why once you're doing something with both hands at the same time, your reaction time goes down, something like that. Whereas now, we're taking a lot of that information we've learned and we're really applying it to how can we use that information to teach people to increase um, motor learning or increase how they would do that, whatever that activity is. So there's a few things that we want to talk about in this chapter. So the first thing we want to do is really define learning. So there's this misconception that if you see someone do better on the test, then you see them learning. No, really, improved performance does not by itself define learning. So that first one, someone can do better on a test, and that doesn't mean they necessarily learned the material. It just means maybe they got lucky, or maybe they had all the answers ahead of time, whatever it is. So first, we need to make sure to establish the fact that improved performance does not by itself define learning. Improved performance, next one, is an indication that learning may have occurred. So it is a hint that, all right, I might be doing something right where the way I'm teaching them. If all of a sudden, you see the kids on your Little League basketball team start making a lot more free throws, you'd say, hey, okay, well, that might be an indication that there is some learning that's going on. But remember that it's motor learning. It is a set of processes associated with practice. So, and the end goal is leading to relevant, permanent gains in the capability for skilled performance. So what that is saying is it's a set of processes that you break down, and as they learn these smaller processes, it results in a higher level of whatever that performance is on that skill. So whether it's a sporting event or playing an instrument, whatever it is. So really, we're going to talk about kind of breaking it down and learning. So when we talk about learning, there's a few things that we want to emphasize. First, learning results from practice or experience. You can't just all of a sudden have learned something. You can't decide, I'm going to sleep on my textbook for a week and then I will have learned it. All you will learn is that sleeping on a textbook probably isn't comfortable. So first, with learning, for learning to occur, there has to be practice or an experience. So it doesn't necessarily have to be a practice, but I watched a video. There's a little kid who, there's a couple of times the mom was holding the kid as she would open the car door and kind of accidentally hit him with the car door, and the kid was fine. But, after that happening a couple of times, the kid was only, 6 months old, but when the mom would go open the car door, the kid would raise his hand up because he was blocking the door. So the kid learned from experience. So that is the first. So it's either got to be from practice or experience. First is not directly observable. You can't actually see learning as it's happening. You can't be like, all right, I'm seeing it going into their brains right now. No, it is inferred from performance changes. So as performance increases, they learned. And as we'll talk about later, learning can also result in negative performance as well. So we'll talk a little more about that later. But and again, this is just to kind of reiterate what that was saying there. It involves a set of processes with the central nervous system. Produces an acquired capability for skills. Now remember, we're talking about skills, and skills are things, and we talked about the attributes of skills. So also kind of make sure you're going back and remembering what the definition of skills are when we're talking about skills. And learning changes are relatively permanent, not transitionary. So if you think about it, if you learned to shoot the basketball when you were a little kid, or whenever, and then you didn't shoot the basketball again for 10 years, yes, you'd be a little bit rusty, but you would still remember the basics of how to shoot a basketball. And that means it was a relatively permanent change. Now, we'll talk about permanent and not permanent as we go along. So first off, performance curves. So that is where you plotted on a graph, the amount of practices they have, and then what their performance is on that task. So, the more, how many times they're practicing, how many days a week they're practicing shooting the ball, basketball, and what their performance is in terms of maybe how many free throws they make. So they can either increase or decrease with practice. So if you don't practice, the more days you go without practicing, maybe your number goes down. The more days you do practice, your number goes up. Also, there is a law of practice that says improvements are rapid at first and then slow later on. So if you think about it, when somebody's first learning to do something, they're really mastering some of those bigger skills. So you see that really big improvement jump from not knowing how to shoot a basketball to at least knowing the correct form to shoot a basketball. Then once they've been doing that for a while and their form is pretty good, you will see still improvements, but they'll be much smaller because it's not as dramatic of things that they're learning. So it then goes, all right, well, if it goes from hitting a golf ball straight to, how do I hit it straight and with a little bit of a curve on it, or straight and backspin, or something like that. So you see a little smaller things, but the big one, going from not knowing how to hit a golf ball at all to learning how to hit a golf ball, is where you're going to see much bigger improvements. So that's performance curves in the law, and that's just an example of that. There are some limitations to performance curves. Performance curves are not learning curves. Again, performance is inferred, and we infer learning happened from performance, but is not always the case. But as with other things in research, the more times or trials you have it, the better idea you get if it was really a skill or if it was just luck. Now, there can be some between subjects effects that mask if performance curves, which means different people will improve at different rates. So it's hard to tell if the skill you're teaching worked well or not. Also, within subject variability is masked as well. From that person, from time to time, they may have a good day and do really well and then drop back down to not doing as well again. And so there are some things that kind of mask the performance curve, but generally speaking, what happens is the more times they do it, the better they get at it. In the beginning, when they're first learning it, they jump up and become a lot better at it a lot quicker. Then as they go on, they'll still continue to improve, but not nearly as quickly. So, temporary and relatively permanent effects of practice. So this is what we're talking about. First, there are relatively permanent effects that persist over time. What I talked about, if you did something for years, learning your form for shooting the basketball, then again, you could go and take 3 years off of shooting the basketball, come back, you will likely shoot with that exact same form. You may not be as accurate because there's some, in terms of how soft or hard to shoot the ball, may vary, but you will still keep those gains. Now, there's also temporary effects. If you've been shooting for years, and you had maybe a bad habit where you popped your elbow out, well, your coach, for that whole practice made you focus on keeping your elbow in. And by the end of that practice, you kept your elbow in, but you came back to practice the next day and you went back to your old habits, then that was a temporary effect. So it vanished with time and or in condition changes. So how do you separate temporary from relatively permanent effects? Some ways to do that is a transfer design test. So what a transfer design test is, it tests a couple of things. One, over the amount of time, and then over some kind of different skills. But the main one we're going to talk about is over time. If you did a skill and you practiced it, and you did it and you got to where you were getting that elbow back in and shooting, then we would wait a week and then we would have you do it again and see if you kept that new skill or if you didn't. Or you can look at it in terms of the number of times they make it. If you taught a skill and they made more free throws, then you waited a week and you wanted to see if they still made that many free throws or if they went back down to making less free throws. And that would be a way you could tell if what they learned was temporary or relatively permanent. Again, allow sufficient time to pass, and sometimes it can vary in the nature depending on the effects. So that's just, again, this is just telling you exactly what I told you. Now, here's an example of a temporary and relatively permanent effects. Now, this is actually due to aid. So what they're talking about here is sometimes you can have something that helps you. So, for example, if you needed to keep your basketball in and you had something that helped you squeezed a towel under your arm while you shot the ball and it reminded you to keep your arm in. Will you continue to keep your arm in and make those shots once you got rid of the towel? So here's an example of that. So they have something called an alignment aid for putting, where it helped you make sure your putter was going straight. So the people who used the alignment aid, and they had a group who didn't use the alignment aid. Alignment aid blue. So you see, during the sessions, and they had 10 sessions of putting the ball. The person who's the alignment aid and who helped them make sure their putter went straight every time, they got a lot better really quick. Now, the people who didn't use the alignment aid improved, but they improved much more modestly in the percentage of putts they made. Then they did 4 transfer trials to see if those were permanent effects that it had on putting. Now you see the first transfer trial for the one with the aid, it was really high up there, and transfer A without the aid was about equal with their best one in practice, which you would think. But what interesting happened is each subsequent trial or transfer trial, the one that was the practice without the aid, they continued to keep their improvements, where the one with the aid, they slowly began to forget what it felt like to hit straight with that aid, and they got worse and worse. And if you look by number D, their putting percentage went all the way back down. So what we would say is that with the alignment aid, that was a temporary improvement, whereas without the aid, just the regular practice was a relatively permanent change. So also, when we think about transfer learning, one of the ways and things you can do, and many of you who have played sports or done anything, played an instrument, you can remember how a lot of times a complex movement is broken down into simpler movements. For safety and concern reasons, you want to make sure that the conditions aren't in a real situation. So if you're teaching how to block somebody in football, and there is a number of things, first what to do with your right foot, then your left foot, then your right arm, then your left arm, then where you're looking. If you're trying to teach them that while there's someone running at you, it would end very poorly. So obviously, when we break these down and teach them, we do it without those real conditions. Same way you think about lifting. So Olympic lifts and Olympic moves. When people are taught how to do Olympic lifts, they don't have weights on the bar when they do it. They don't usually even have a bar. A lot of times they'll be given like a broomstick or something. And once they learn all of that correct form, then they'll slowly add the weights. But they do that for safety reasons. So how is transfer measured? Transfer concern, we want to estimate the performance level of criterion with the relatively permanent effects of learning separated from a temporary effect. So what are we doing and how is it measured? So let me show you. So we can measure and see if there is a positive or negative transfer. And we can see if doing this activity allows someone to perform better than someone who didn't do the activity, and that would be a positive transfer that occurs. So did they do better than people who didn't practice? And then did a negative transfer occur? Did people who practice do worse than people who didn't practice? So, and you can think about it in terms of people who practiced maybe, practiced with poor form or practiced swinging a baseball bat and then it affected their golf swing negatively, or something like that. So positive transfer. So we're testing for two things when we're testing for transfer. Was there an improvement over people who didn't practice? And we're looking to see sometimes, was it worse than people who didn't practice? So sometimes, you can have either or. But those are the two big things when we're looking for transfer. So also with transfer, the things we're going to look at is specialized versus general transfer. Specific transfer happens with that specific situation. When we're testing, is it the exact same for that specific situation? So if I had a basketball player and we taught them to stand in this one spot, 5 feet from the goal, and shoot the ball, was and at the same goal with the same basketball, and then we looked to see over time, did teaching them, did helping them practice for that position at that shot increase the number of shots they made. If it did, then that would be a specific transfer because it happened at specific place, specific time, with the specific situation. Now, for more generalized transfer to relatively different activities in the goal. So obviously, they're going to shoot in more than just that one spot, that one time. So we're going to see if they practice shooting in that one spot over and over, when they get into the game and they moved to different spots, but still stay maybe 5 feet away from the goal, but move to different spots, did their overall shooting percentage go up? Did practice shooting in that one spot help overall in that area right under the goal? And so that would be generalized transfer, and that would really kind of ideally, in many situations, what you're looking for is that that overall skill. In certain situations, you want that specific transfer, but generally in sports, you're not going to have the exact same circumstances and exact same situations every time as you did in practice. Then we also have near and far transfer. So near transfer is what I was talking about when they shot from one spot under the goal. If we move them to a different spot, maybe the same distance away under the goal, does that transfer? The shooting, under the goal from the right side and under the goal improve shooting under the left side as well, or does it just improve under the right side? Then we also have far transfer. So far transfer would say, hey, the shooting under the goal transferred to shooting from the 3-point line. Did shooting under the goal from that spot, just shooting in general, did it help improve even their 3-point shooting? Now, when it's far transfer, it doesn't literally mean farther away transfer. It means that the task is not as closely related. So you could even say, did kicking a soccer ball help improve their field goal kicking? I don't know. So that'd be more of a far transfer. So think about those two, but both of those, near and far, it's important to remember both near and far transfer are types of generalized transfer. So it's not going to be the exact same as what it was in practice. So when we're thinking about types of transfer for the test, make sure you can think of an example of a specific transfer, a generalized transfer, and then from a generalized transfer, a near and a far transfer. So if you can think of all of those, then you are good to go. If you have any questions, shoot me an email.